Hey, it's good to be with you. And it would be even better, of course, if my thing just hadn't died in me. There we are. It's back. So, I'm going to begin with a wee quote. A wee quote that kind of seems opposite, given what Alan was talking about earlier and some of the changes that we're thinking about making. And here's the wee quote. The wee quote is this: "The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better." The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. I just kind of love that. However, I have to admit to you, I find it an awful lot easier to say than to live. The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. I've been in so many conversations over the years, I suspect you have too. At least one this week that I can think of, where people can offer an absolutely brilliant critique of what's being suggested, of what's wrong with the current way of doing things, but actually offer very little imagination for an alternative. That sort of critique feels rife in every stratum of our society, in our families, in our neighbourhoods, in our politics, in our workplaces, and in our churches. That telling folk, well, that's a daft way to do things, seems rife. They used to say of Robin Cook, that some of you might remember, that he was a better foreign secretary in opposition than he ever was in government. And it kind of felt slightly unfair, because I think it's probably true of most of us. I spent quite a lot of my life being able to offer a really good critique of what was wrong with the church's system, and then found myself for a period of time as one of the people who were responsible for trying to lead that system, and it was an awful lot easier to criticise it than it was to lead it. I wouldn't have done it that way. I didn't know what they're thinking about. We've probably all said it, and we certainly all thought it. It's entirely understandable, but it doesn't really get us anywhere. The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. 3 things I love about this quote. 1, it doesn't pretend that there isn't room for criticism about the current way of doing things. Of course there is. 2, it isn't paralysed from doing anything, because before we do anything, we've got to have it all worked out, and it all needs to be perfect. It doesn't. It just needs to have the desire to be better. And 3, this is about doing stuff, practicing the better, not just talking about it. Deeds, we know, speak louder than words. But sometimes, isn't it, it's easier just to stick with the words, especially words that tell other folk what they've got wrong. And so with all of that by way of introduction, let's travel back some 8 centuries before the birth of Jesus to the time of the prophet Isaiah. And then let's drop in first century Palestine and John the Baptist before arriving back in 21st century Langside. Isaiah and John were prophets. And we often think that prophecy is about predicting the future. But actually, it's far more about imagining the future by holding a mirror up to the present. Isaiah's vision that we heard earlier, it just seems unimaginable, doesn't it? Wolves and lambs, cows and bears, snakes and children. Didn't he be daft? When's all that going to happen? And the idea that at a moment when the royal line of succession was in turmoil, as it was when Isaiah was speaking, that a new monarch would emerge from David's line seemed completely bonkers. Especially one who would judge people not by how they looked or dressed, who would have love for the poor at the heart of their reign, and who would rule with integrity and justice. All of that, given what they were going through, just seemed beyond belief. In a world where none of these things were happening, or seemed even remotely possible, or could ever happen, ever. And yet, here we are today, recognizing in the prophetic words of Isaiah not just a critique of all that was wrong in and around the time when King Uzziah died, holding up that mirror to the age, but also pointing to the possibility which you and I together believe is revealed in Jesus Christ. The baby born in a stable, who grew up as a refugee, was ridiculed by leaders, was killed as a criminal, was buried in a borrowed grave, who died and then 3 days later rose from the dead. Who says that these unimaginable things can't happen? We are here today because we believe, some of us hanging on by our fingertips to do so, but because we believe that they did happen in Jesus. A day is coming, says the prophet, when the new king from the royal line of David will be a symbol to the nations. They will gather in his royal city and give him honor. And they have. And they do. And they will. And that's despite all the awfulness of what happens in Jerusalem and in surrounding territories. And then we move we move from Isaiah 8 centuries before Jesus to John the Baptist, to the one that Isaiah himself had spoken about as shouting in the desert, preparing the way, making straight the road for the Lord to travel. And at a time when many religious folk were content just to get along with the Romans as well as they could, to not rock the boat, to keep their faith and religion private, to just say nothing that might upset folk. There was John, blinking John, holding up a mirror. "You snakes," he said, "don't imagine for a moment that you can escape the wrath of God just because of who you are, who you're descended from." You know, I don't think I would have liked John the Baptist very much. He would have been a bit too challenging, a bit too uncomfortable for my liking. Not just the camel cloth clothes and the locusts, a bit of first century "I'm a celebrity, get me out of here." But all this stuff that he said and did, saying and doing stuff that I know is right, but would rather was not said, and definitely not put into action. I think I would have found, and I'm just being really honest about this, I would have found John a bit too awkward, holding up a mirror to my tendency to prefer just to live and let live, to keep my mouth shut and just get on with things. I really don't like the language of winnowing shovels, gathering the wheat, the good stuff in the barn, but burning the chaff, the useless stuff in the fire that never goes out. Especially if there's even the remotest of possibilities that I might be more chaff than wheat, more pointless than purposeful. But just because I don't like it doesn't mean that I can ignore it. You see, prophets are uncomfortable and disturbing folks to be in the company of in the 8th century before Jesus was born, in the 1st century when Jesus came among us, and in the 21st century when Jesus still reigns and challenges and provokes and irritates and inspires. And yeah, we still need prophets, uncomfortable though they are. So what's the provocation for us? Well, there are many. Here's just a few. How might the ways that we live reflect the possibility that the lion and the lamb lie down together? That sworn enemies become friends? That power imbalances are turned upside down? And not just talk about these things, or assume that the responsibility for turning these things into reality rests with others. But us getting on with it, putting it into practice, not being content with the way things are. Or provocation number 2. How might the community that we live in, the city of which we're a part, reflect the values of the King of the Jews, who rules with integrity and justice, where everyone has enough to eat, where everyone can keep themselves and others warm, where people aren't alone when they crave company. Or provocation number 3. How might the church, not the church out there, stuff that, the church in here, our church, become less preoccupied with the loss of the past and more focused on a future that's not yet fully imagined, where our deeds match our words and where our words match the gospel, where our worship truly reflects the beauty of God, and where our community of faith, this wee fragile community of faith, is a sign of God's everlasting presence. And where our criticism of the bad, the things that aren't as good as they could or should be, is reflected in our practice of the better. Prophetic, awkward, challenging. It's easier to point the finger than to get the finger out. I know this. I'm that person. But I also know I can glimpse in your company enough of a prophetic alternative to want to imagine the better into practice. A practice that reflects the possibilities of God. Friends, we can do this. We're loved. It's what we are, and it's what we're called to be. Amen.